when you have a power meter on your bike, there's some specific things that you have to do in order to really utilize this tool, because otherwise you're just kind of riding around with a really expensive bike computer on your bike. So there's some basics there. First off, we have to understand our training zones and our training levels, and then we know we're going to ride at specific places, and then we can use that on our ride. So let's say, for example, the very basic, an active recovery ride. When you're doing an active recovery ride, you're using your PowerTap power meter as a governor. It's a ceiling. I'm riding underneath 56% of my threshold power, which may be, 150 watts, and you just ride underneath that, and you realize, like, wow, I've never ridden this slow before, right? Because you weren't really actually recovering. You're riding too hard to actually really be in active recovery mode. So that's the first one. I use it just as a ceiling, as a governor in those types of rides. Then, if I'm using it for a tempo ride, a more intense ride, I'm using it to ensure that I am really training in that zone. All right, so for me, that's probably around 250 watts to 290 watts, and I'm in that range, and so I'm trying to keep my power in that range. I always give my athletes a range of power for them to do. It's very, very difficult to say, okay, you need to hold it between 5 watts. Unless you live in a totally dead flat area or you're on your trainer, it's almost impossible. So we give them a range, and you're in that range and you're training there. Then when we get to very specific intervals, let's say you're going to work on your anaerobic capacity, and I'm going to give an athlete 1 minute efforts, and they have to do 120% of their threshold power in that 1 minute effort. Then I'm saying, okay, you need to hold 350 watts up to 370 watts every time you do this interval. And so they're looking at that number and they're staying above 350 the whole time. And they're focused on it, and they're digging deep, and they're really pushing themselves. So I'm using it from those perspectives. The other thing that I really look at too is the interval function is really critical. So when you're out doing intervals, let's say you have 10 hill repeats to do, we're hitting the interval button at the start of the interval, and then we're hitting it at the end of the interval to capture the data just for that effort itself. Because there's a concept of what we call intervals, optimal intervals. How many intervals should I do? And you can use your power meter to understand exactly how many intervals should you do in a given workout. And that is something that is very different than anything we've ever had before. We've never known how many intervals we had to do. Before it was like, well, my buddy's doing 10 hill intervals, so I'm gonna do 12. I'm gonna do a couple more than he does. Well, maybe that day you were really fatigued, you should have only done 4. We don't know. But now, using the interval function on your PowerTap dual head unit, it makes a huge difference, because you know when you start to fatigue beyond a certain point and you're not training that system anymore. So that's a critical thing. Reviewing the intervals as you do them, very, very important. The last thing that I do on the bike is I look at the total amount of work, the kilojoules, because I use it for more of a nutritional perspective. Because your kilojoules are roughly equivalent to your calories. And so if I burn 2,000 kilojoules, well, I know that's around 2,000, 2,200 calories that I burn. How much food have I taken in? So I use it to help me pace my fueling, and that's a really important part as well. So those 3 things are really the biggest things that or more than that, but those are big key things we use when we're on the bike.